Hi everyone, my name is Sophia Pink. I'm an engineering major from Washington, D.C., a place where people sometimes carry around a copy of the US Constitution in their pocket. Let me read you one line, the Second Amendment. It says, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." It's a little confusing, a little weirdly phrased, but for over 200 years, people thought this was about states' rights to form their own militias, not individual people's rights to own and carry around a gun. And just a few decades ago, no one imagined that this one sentence provides a constitutional right for dads to tote a weapon to lunch, for moms to carry a rifle down the sidewalk, or for churchgoers to bring a handgun to Sunday service. So, what happened? Well, let me introduce you to one key player behind much of this change, the National Rifle Association, or NRA. The NRA advocates for gun rights and wants to make it easy for people to buy and own guns. Although the NRA has members who pay dues, its true funding comes from gun manufacturers who donate millions of dollars to the organizations, buy expensive advertisements in the NRA's publications, and even have deals where if you buy a gun, you get a free NRA membership. But the NRA changed the way we read the Constitution by starting somewhere a little bit closer to home. So today, I'm going to talk about how the NRA shot down the Ivory Tower. The NRA used a two-part strategy to change the way we interpret the Constitution and make decisions about guns in the United States. It knocked down science and built up legal scholarship, and made sure that we don't use science and scientific evidence to make decisions about guns, and instead rely on work by a small group of legal scholars who support the NRA's point of view. So first, the NRA used three tactics to knock down science. It suppressed research, delegitimized scientific authority, and changed the metaphor that we use to talk about guns. In 1993, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the main federal agency charged with protecting public health and safety, funded a study that found a link between having a gun in a home and an increased risk of homicide at that same location. This study started to receive lots of publicity, and the NRA was furious. It wanted to make sure that this did not happen again. So the NRA lobbied Congress, and Congress added one line to a congressional act in 1996, saying that no funds can be used to advocate or promote gun control. This means that for the past 20 years, the government has funded virtually no research on guns and gun control. Think about that for a moment. The federal agency charged with protecting public safety has been prohibited from doing any research on guns. But the NRA knows it can't simply prevent all research from happening in the first place. So instead of engaging in scientific conversation, it has simply tried to delegitimize scientific authority itself. Let's take a look at some of the headlines that the NRA publishes or links to on their website that are about science. They're things like weird science, science fiction, junk science, bogus science, Bloomberg's scientists hoping to disprove your fundamental rights. The NRA is trying to instill a distrust in scientists. We can zoom in on one article by Wayne LaPierre, who's the executive vice president of the NRA. In this article, he mentions the word science with no qualifiers once, but writes about junk science or bogus science 5 times. LaPierre also employs the NRA's favorite rhetorical bullet, the quotation mark. He writes about research twice as often as simply research. And you'll be hearing more of this soon. Here's an article by Chris Cox, who leads the NRA's Institute for Legal Action, and who also just happens to be leading Donald Trump's coalition on the Second Amendment. But that's another story. In this article, he writes about scientific evidence 10 times as often as just writing about evidence. Through mockery and quotation marks, the NRA is delegitimizing scientific authority itself. But perhaps the most powerful tactic that the NRA uses to knock down science is that it's changed the metaphor that we use to talk about guns. The NRA does not want us to see guns as a public health issue. It does not want us to use the metaphor of disease to talk about guns and gun control. Instead, the NRA wants us to see any issues as not due to guns themselves, but to bad people who are out there. Like in this quote by Wayne LaPierre, where he warns people of an unknown number of genuine monsters who populate our society. Now, you may say, okay, this is just language, this is just metaphors, it doesn't really have a real impact. Well, let me tell you about a study by 2 Stanford psychologists. They realized that when people talk about crime, sometimes they refer to crime as a virus, like a crime epidemic. And sometimes people think of crime as a beast, so something that hunts down a city. They presented participants with a paragraph about crime in a fictional city. It was almost exactly the same, but for half the participants, they referred to crime as a virus, infecting or plaguing a city. For the other half, they referred to it as a beast, preying on or lurking in a city. They then asked participants to suggest solutions to the crime problem. Those in the virus condition were more likely to suggest reformatory solutions, things like improving education, improving healthcare, investigating the root causes. If people take this approach, if people use this metaphor for gun violence, this may lead to more research, more studies, like the one that the CDC funded earlier. In contrast, those in the beast condition advocated for more enforcement-related solutions, things like harsher penalties, longer jail times, more police. If we take this approach to gun violence, this would lead us to a solution that involves more guns, protect ourselves against those evil outsiders. The virus metaphor leads us to one set of solution, one that involves more research. The beast metaphor leads us to another, one that likely involves more guns. Through these 3 tactics, the NRA wants to convince us that guns are none of science's business. But now, there's a vacuum around guns. If we're not using science to make decisions, then what do we use? Well, that's where part 2 of the NRA's double-barrel strategy comes in. It spent the last 40 years building up a body of legal scholarship that supports this idea that guns are an individual right guaranteed by the Constitution. In 1991, the Supreme Court Justice Warren Burger, who was a Republican appointed by a Republican president, called this individual rights view of the Second Amendment a fraud. He said it was a fraud on the American people. Yet, in 2008, less than 20 years later, the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment does protect an individual right to possess a firearm. So, what happened here? Well, to put it bluntly, the NRA constructed an echo machine and fueled it with cash. Let me explain. As a case study, I'm going to talk about Stephen Holbrook, who's an attorney and former professor. In the late 1970s, he was one of the few scholars who held this opinion of the individual rights view that Justice Burger called a fraud. But then the NRA began to sponsor seminars and conferences, here's a more recent one, Holbrook, where these few scholars could interact with each other, where they could talk to each other. And gradually, they began to publish more papers, all citing each other and using similar methods. So even though there were only a few scholars, and they'd only been doing this for a few years, it made it appear that there was a bigger body of research out there than there actually was. This was the start of the echo machine. But all machines need fuel, and the NRA fueled theirs with cash. Let's look at Holbrook again. The year before the Supreme Court case, Holbrook received $75,000 from the NRA. He worked as an attorney for the NRA 5 different times, and just last year, he received even more money to write a book. Again, there's nothing illegal about this, but it should make any sensible person a little bit suspicious. It's also not just Holbrook. The NRA endowed a $1 million professorship of the Second Amendment at George Mason University. The NRA hired scholars to also represent the NRA as lawyers, and gave almost $400,000 to just one individual. Just to reiterate, this is not illegal, but in the same way as if a pharmaceutical company were doing drug research, the NRA sponsoring scholarship is a little bit dubious. Over time, these scholars published more papers, and fueled by this cash, the echo machine grew and grew and grew. Now, you may say, okay, that's nice, but people making important decisions about our country will know where this information comes from. They'll realize that it has some biases. Well, let's take a look at the scholars that Justice Scalia cited in his opinion in the 2008 DC versus Heller case about the Second Amendment. Who comes up? Holbrook. Holbrook again. Not a bad investment. Who else comes up? Malcolm. Who is Joyce Malcolm? Oh, there she is, in one of the many conferences they attended that were sponsored by the NRA. Who else is cited? Cates. Who is Don Cates? Oh, there he is. He worked for the NRA. machine if it can reverberate all the way to the Supreme Court. Strategies, knocking down science and building up legal scholarship, the NRA has done something extremely powerful. They've essentially changed the Constitution. This amendment, right here, used to mean one thing, but now it means something completely different. For some of you, this may be a good thing. You may agree with the NRA's point of view, but I can think of some people who may disagree. The over 30,000 Americans who die each year due to guns, and the over 80,000 people who are injured. At an institution like Stanford, we're in a position of power. This research and scholarship happens at places just like our own. So we owe it to these victims and their families to fight to open up research, to re-legitimize science, and to take back the metaphor, because guns are a public health issue. It's all of our responsibility to make sure that the decisions we make about our country aren't based on work by a few lawyers in an echo machine fueled by cash, but are based on thorough, scientific, not in quotes, evidence. Thank you.